This is a vegan chicken nugget. In some ways, it represents one of the great debates throughout the history of mankind and science, the intelligence and moral status of animals. Wherever you stand, it's common for us meat-eaters to have a moment of reflection when we consider the billions of animals slaughtered all over the globe each year, and then spend another lazy afternoon rubbing our faces in our precious cat's bellies. I feel like my cat loves me. What about the cows? What about the pigs? Do they love also? Do they contemplate right and wrong, good and evil? Do they engage in dramatic battles of wits amongst themselves in a sophisticated language unknown to us? If only we could ask them questions, we could learn so much. This seems nothing but fantasy, though. Talking animals of all kinds are the stuff of children's stories and fairy tales. Frog and Toad, the Frog Prince, the Great Gamabunta, and Kermit the Frog. There was Koko the gorilla, who was allegedly quite fluent in gorilla sign language, but scientists have levied significant criticism at the strong positive claims made about Koko's fluency. There was Nim Chimpsky, who's one in a long line of animals mimicking human-like behaviors to receive treats. And the very first chimp in this line was Washoe, a chimp born in West Africa, then captured by the Air Force and forced to learn sign language in Washoe County, Nevada. The details and conclusions of these investigations are contested, but it seems we still have a long way to go before we can train animals to truly communicate original thought with humans using language. A long way to go before we can train an animal in the arts, in grammar, and in performing mathematics like adding fractions and converting them to decimals. Or do we? Meet Hans the horse, or well, that's clever Hans to you. This horse was an intellectual to be reckoned with. He could count people in a crowd, tally the men and women separately, count their hats, glasses, and umbrellas. He could count the windows upon distant houses. He could add fractions and convert common fractions to decimals. He could list a number's factors. He carried the year's calendar in his big horsey head. He could tell you the date of any day you wish. Being a horse in Germany, it's only natural that he could read German. He could identify all tones within the C major scale and recognized intervals like the third and the fifth. Educators of the time determined clever Hans to be at the stage of development of a child about 13 or 14 years old. In the minds of the German populace who saw Hans perform his incredible feats in the early 1900s, it seemed that the turn of the century had brought with it a turn in the human perspective of the world and their place in it. And at once, what used to be considered lower forms evidently had the same faculties of rationality and capacity for understanding language that man thought he alone possessed. And as the great mind of clever Hans went to work entertaining and shocking Germans with daily performances, the great human machine of wonder and skepticism was put into force all over the globe, with newspaper articles, magazine features, postcards, toys, and liquor labels, and of course, attempts at explanation for Hans's act that couldn't possibly be what it seemed. Hans was an Orloff stallion who, after 4 years of training, gave his performances beginning in Berlin, Germany in the early 1900s. He was trained by his owner, the retired schoolteacher Wilhelm von Osten, who apparently became bored with teaching humans and so used his same tried and true teaching techniques on his horse. Hans's chief means of expression was tapping his front right hoof. With taps of the hoof, numerical questions were straightforward to answer. For example, what is 2/5 plus 1/2? A human may convert 2/5 to 4/10 and 1/2 to 5/10, and then add them to arrive at a final correct answer of 9/10, which of course can be written down. Hans, however, would apparently do the math in his head, then tap 9 times for the numerator, and then another 10 taps for the denominator. Many other things could be converted to numbers also, so Hans could communicate with taps. Letters of the alphabet could be assigned numbers, tones of the musical scale have well-known numerical representations, and playing cards too were assigned numbers. While the great number of things Hans could address through taps of his hoof may seem like a monotonous show, it's impressive that Hans didn't just tap his hoof and then suddenly stop when his trainer observed that the right answer had been achieved. Hans' tapping method itself seemed to reveal an awareness of the answer, both at the start and at the finish. He'd tap small numbers slowly, but would hasten his rhythm with larger numbers. And he'd return his right hoof to an initial resting position after his final tap, or sometimes do the final tap with his left hoof, as if to lock in and punctuate his answer. He could also grab requested objects, like picking a cloth of a particular color, or go to a person in the crowd whose picture he had been shown. And he had his head, which he could point up or down, or left or right to answer additional questions. When asked what arm a person was holding up, he would move his head left or right to answer, and got these questions correct, even though the right arm of a person facing him would be to his left. He still answered correctly by indicating right. These incredible performances made waves. On September 4th, 1904, Hans was featured in the New York Times. The headline read, "Berlin's Wonderful Horse. He can do almost everything but talk. How he was taught." The article begins with a short list of reputable individuals who can attest to the intelligence of Hans the horse. The famous zoologist Professor Mobius, who was the director of the Prussian Natural History Museum, other eminent scientific and military authorities, and Dr. Stutt, the Prussian Minister of Education. In fact, Dr. Stutt was such a fan of Hans that he wanted Hans to perform for Emperor Wilhelm II. But when the other ministers objected to having the horse put on a show, Dr. Stutt threatened to resign from his position. Perhaps after a good sleep, cooler heads prevailed, and Dr. Stutt decided not to hinge his political position in education on the show of an educated horse. In an article about talented circus horses, another American writer gave Hans a level of romantic praise that a beautiful lady could scarcely get out of an enamored poet. Writing, "Berlin, however, has an animal of the species now on show, which has gone beyond precedent in cultivation and exhibits phenomena of cerebration out of all parallels." All the press brought even more attention to clever Hans. Animal psychologist Karl Kroll, for example, started following Hans in the press in 1904 and began regularly attending his shows in 1905. Aside from all the praise and intrigue, a man's horse can't add fractions without provoking a significant amount of skepticism. Indeed, you might think that Hans the horse was just memorizing all the correct responses to questions he was repeatedly asked. But as you'll soon find out, the truth of the matter was a lot more interesting. Unfortunately, many students struggling to learn key subjects like mathematics, data analysis, and programming do merely skate by through rote memorization. That's where today's sponsor, Brilliant.org, can help. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons to help you build your understanding from the ground up. Their course on solving equations will give you a real conceptual understanding of the key skills in algebra, with an emphasis on developing not only the mechanical skills, but thinking intuitively about the material. Understanding the feats of Hans the horse required analysis of experimental data. Brilliant's data courses are a perfect way to start learning data analysis, covering everything from data visualizations to algorithms and regression models. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/wrathofmath, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the description. Brilliant's also given Wrath of Math viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. So surely Hans's brilliance was nothing but memorization. This con from von Osten and his silly horse was nothing new. With enough patience, any talented trainer can get an animal to do what appear to be amazing things, when at the end of the day, it's always just an animal responding to cues in a way it thinks will earn a treat. Indeed, there is a gesture quite well suited to cueing an animal in an exhibition, where a presenter stands upright as a fence post throughout a performance, but uses a slight forward bend as a cue. This is an effective cue for the animal who's viewing from the side, and can thus perceive the bend clearly. But for the audience who is viewing from the front, a slight forward bend is practically invisible. Also giving shows in Hans's time was a mare named Rosa, whose trainer used the forward bend as a cue. And before this, it was used with the performing dog in Utrecht in the Netherlands. I mean, nearly 100 years before Hans became the talk of Berlin, a dog had been eye-trained to focus on his master's eyes and to then select the object that his master fixated upon. This was presented as a case of a highly intelligent animal, but the dog's master would not permit anyone else to attempt working with him. The two naturalists, A. and K. Mueller, wrote, "The whole affair aimed at deceiving the public, and the dog's reputation was but a means of making money." And there's no reason to believe that clever Hans was anything more. Surely, for all of his feats, he shared an exclusive and lengthy list of cues with his master von Osten, and any other man working with Hans would receive nothing but error and imitation from the beast. Right? Well, in fact, Hans had answered questions correctly from strangers in some isolated cases. This was perhaps not widely known nor recognized yet. But in mid-July of 1904, the Berlin populace was lucky to have the zoologist George Schillings on the scene to debunk this Hans hogwash once and for all. He entered into the courtyard that Hans called home, skeptical and ready to see what everybody already knew to be true. The horse couldn't possibly answer questions correctly without whatever cues he had been recognizing from his master. The responses Hans gave to Mr. Schillings' quiz were correct. Mr. Schillings, now convinced that Hans was as intelligent as claimed, began to show off the horse himself and brought even more guests to witness the genesis of animal intelligence. Even if Mr. Schillings hadn't received correct responses from Hans, nobody would write off a horse for being a little off his game when in the presence of a stranger. Any wrong answers could easily be chalked up to stress from not having his familiar handler at his side. Regardless, Mr. Schillings' vote of confidence in Hans did nothing for skeptics but make them lump him in with von Osten and the horse as co-conspirators in this ridiculous ruse. But one had to ask, what is the ruse? What was motivating von Osten's silly horse scheme, and what would convince a reputable zoologist to go along with it? In all similar acts, it was easy to see money at the root. Hans himself knew the values of all the German coins. Yes, the horse could explain the money, but with this horse, money doesn't explain a thing. How much did von Osten charge to come see his wise horse perform? Nothing. It was always free. When a local vaudeville company offered to pay von Osten between 30 and 60,000 German marks a month, what did he say? No thanks. He was an old and unmarried man with seemingly no wants in the world but to show off his pride and joy. His precious, clever Hans. Among the Hans skeptics, some thought he didn't deserve his noble title of Clever Hans and would not regard him as intelligent, but perhaps found learned to be a more accurate descriptor. They thought his performances were nothing but memorization. How could Hans tell the time on a watch? It must be that he was asked to read the watch at the same time each day, and had simply learned to respond to the question with the correct number of hoof taps. They also believed he had simply memorized the correct number of hoof taps to receive a carrot for whichever arithmetic question he was asked. A still more critical group would regard Hans as neither clever nor learned, saying he knew nothing. Rather was he to be regarded as a stupid Hans, and totally dependent upon signs or helps given by his master. They believed Hans's feats were the equivalent of all the other circus animals. Of course, if that was the case, one has to ask, what would those signs be? Critics pointed to the slouch hat von Osten always wore while giving performances as an obvious candidate for signaling. If not the hat, then maybe it was von Osten's long and suspicious coat, or perhaps the movement of his hand as he reached for carrots into the deep, suspicious pockets of that coat. Or maybe, as with the eye-trained dog from nearly a century prior, the window to von Osten's soul was for Hans, the window to von Osten's carrots. Whatever the cues for Hans may be, surely if an independent expert in the field of trickery and showmanship had a good long look at Hans and his handler, he could lift the veil on this fanciful marriage of horse and intellect. Sure enough, the president of the Internationale Artisten Genossenschaft, an international association of performing artists, saw Hans tap and nod his way through a show and watched von Osten diligently for the cues that must be given to the horse. After this, the president said, "I was fully convinced that I would be able to explain the problem in this way, but I was mistaken. He had no choice but to become a Hans believer." This is getting out of hand. The owner who keeps doing these silly horse shows doesn't want any money whatsoever. The horse can perform with his trainer or with strangers. And even an expert on performing tricks can't find a single sign or cue between horse and handler. It was time to gather a team of experts. No more hearsay. No more one guy goes and looks at the horse and discovers nothing. If we're gonna outsmart this horse and his 60-some-year-old trainer, we're gonna need to go all out. In the face of rising scrutiny, von Osten was all in on clever Hans, and at his urging, the German Department of Education put together a team of 13 people. Led by the philosopher and psychologist Karl Stumpf, this commission also included circus manager Paul Busch, the Count Otto zu Castel-Rudenhausen, teachers Dr. Grabeau and Robert Hahn, zoologists Dr. Ludwig Heck and Dr. Oscar Heinroth, veterinarian Dr. Miesner, retired military Major F.W. von Keller and Major General T.H. Koring, physiologist Professor Nagel, and others. This super team spent a year and a half studying the issue of clever Hans, or stupid Hans, as many thought was a better title. And in September of 1904, after they had put many questions to Hans in pursuit of the truth, the so-called Hans Commission concluded there is no trickery whatsoever in the performances of the horse, and the methods employed by the owner in teaching Hans differ essentially from those used by trainers and correspond with those used in teaching children. The expert commission decides that the horse actually reasons. What? Well, that's how many people took the report of the Hans Commission, that Hans was indeed an intelligent creature. But the report was truthfully more nuanced than this. The commission gave no opinion on the matter of Hans' capacity for thought. Indeed, they state their purpose in the report, saying the undersigned came together for the purpose of investigating the question whether or not there is involved in the feats of the horse of Mr. von Osten anything of the nature of tricks, that is, intentional influence or aid on the part of the questioner. Hence, in their report, they ruled out intentional tricks, and they went a step further to say all known unintentional signs that could be present have also been ruled out. Thus, two possibilities remained. Either Hans was as clever as they said, or there were unintentional signs given by whoever was asking Hans the questions that were completely imperceptible to man, but as clear to Hans as carrots are delicious. The commission concluded that this was a serious matter to contend with that demanded further investigation. Finally, the aforementioned Karl Stumpf, his co-worker Oscar Funkst, and Dr. Erich von Hornbostel were able to put science to work in explaining the clever Hans phenomenon, and they summarized their findings in a report on December 9th, 1904. They were finally able to get Hans to answer questions incorrectly consistently by asking him questions whose solutions were unknown to any of the persons present. For example, if a number of objects were placed in front of Hans in a manner not visible to those present, Hans failed to count the objects correctly. Or two people separately whisper a number in Hans's ears and then ask him to add them. Neither individual knew the correct answer since they only knew their individual numbers, and hence Hans was unable to answer the sum correctly. In tests where the answer was known to the presenters, Hans got the answer correct 29 out of 31 times. But when the answer was unknown, Hans only answered correctly by luck 3 out of 31 times. It was concluded from this and similar experiments that Hans could neither count, read, nor do arithmetic. There were peculiar theories of the correct answer being transmitted to Hans through telepathy or some sort of mental energy like N-rays, a once hypothesized form of radiation. But those questions where the answer wasn't known to anyone present, especially the questioner, debunked such an explanation. Going a step further, the investigation found that Hans answered incorrectly when his view of the people present was blocked by sufficiently large blinders. This then confirms that Hans relied on some sort of visual sign to guide his responses, a sign which he was not consciously trained with, but which those who had asked him questions must have been giving unintentionally. To completely validate these conclusions, Mr. Funkst, who was particularly adept at perceiving the slightest visual stimuli due to some prior lab experience, was able to identify the key movements that von Osten exhibited that led Hans to his correct solutions. It essentially came down to an escalating level of tension in the questioner, which resolved into relaxation when the correct answer was reached. Funkst could then utilize what were typically unintentional movements and put them into practice deliberately to elicit whatever response he desired from Hans, even without asking a question or giving a command. Hans had learned to respond to these cues not to answer math trivia correctly, but for the timeless gift of bread and carrots. Having established in their experiments that Hans's responses could be controlled deliberately, it was reasonable to revisit the question of whether or not this whole thing had been a most impressive performance in deception from the start by von Osten and his hungry horse. To this, Professor Stumpf wrote, "No one has the right to charge an old man who has never had a blemish on his reputation with having invented a most refined network of lies, if the facts can be explained in a satisfactory manner in some other rational way." This is a chicken nugget. While man continues to wonder what the true capacity of the beast is, if we may eat our chicken nuggets without worry or guilt, we wish only to be able to experience the animal mind firsthand, to understand its commonalities and divergences with our own minds fully. But in these worries, we may find some comfort in the story of clever Hans. If such unexampled patience and high pedagogical excellence as was daily successfully brought to bear by Mr. von Osten during the course of 4 long years could not bring to light the slightest trace of conceptual thinking, then we may persist, all the more confident in the belief that such levels of thought are not possible outside of ourselves. And when this romantic endeavor of training beasts to think like man would take place again, it could be done with an awareness of one source of error which had hitherto gone unnoticed: the clever Hans effect. Oscar Funkst published a comprehensive review of these events in 1907. Clever Hans, the Horse of Mr. von Osten, a contribution to experimental animal and human psychology. After this, the number of celebrity animal whiz kids actually went up. Both attention and disputes over the animal's merits were still in great supply. Mr. Wilhelm von Osten passed away on June 29, 1909, at the age of 70. Clever Hans was bequeathed to the aforementioned animal psychologist Karl Krahl, who had been a regular at Hans's shows since 1905. In fact, back in 1907, Krahl had explored telepathic communication with von Osten and Hans together. Krahl concluded from his experiments with the pair that Hans was both a proficient mathematician and a medium. Suffice to say, in Krahl's hands, Hans' work was far from over. The disparity between man and animal may forever persist, but we nonetheless find love with which to fill in the gaps. It is no rare person who loves and cherishes an animal, clever or not, like a member of his own family. It's worth visiting Karl Krahl's story another time, but for Hans, the sad end must here be included. World War I began on July 28, 1914, shortly after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. As a result, once a celebrity horse treated daily with awe, applause, wonder, bread, carrots, and the love of his longtime owner, Clever Hans was drafted into the war as a military horse. He died in 1916, either killed in action or consumed by hungry soldiers. Intelligent or stupid, learned or trained, Clever Hans taught us an important lesson. An animal can see clearly enough to appear as if it understands language and mathematics, music and written words, when all it really sees is the promised goodness of its beloved owner. That's what Hans saw. And never could he have seen the careless evils of humanity coming to end his once peaceful and idyllic life in Mr. von Osten's courtyard. For a beast, unable to truly understand language and think on matters of morality, is also unable to see the beast in the man who does.